how you became interested in economics?
I'm not quite sure. I was going to, when I was an undergrad, when I was in school, I actually thought of reading philosophy. And my headmistress at my convent boarding school told me I shouldn't go to Cambridge because they were all atheists. So instead I went to Oxford, which had a program in economics, politics, and philosophy. And so I gravitated towards the economics. And they were atheists there too.
There's a lot of my earphones. How do I turn that down? And it was up to like negative 24.
Yeah, so then it just became a way of seeing the world. So once I was into economics, it became a way of looking at the world around me.
And what were you interested in the world around you? Sounds like you had a religious background. Does that bring some?
No, I was an atheist background. I became an atheist when I was about 13. I went to confession and told the priest I had doubts about the existence of God, and he said, "Don't be silly, you're too young." But I went on anyway. So when I went up to Oxford, the Labour Party in Britain had just gone into office with Harold Wilson, and it was a time when everyone was actually being increasingly disillusioned with the Labour Party from the left. And I was, for some reason or other, I was a socialist by then, on the side of the working class. So I was kind of to the left of the British Labour Party. Then at the end of my first year at Oxford, I came over to the United States on vacation and ended up, to my good luck, in Mississippi, where I worked in the civil rights movement for a couple of months. And that was perhaps the most important experience that I had.
Let's go back though for a second, because I'm curious
Sure.
about how you came to some identification with the working.
Britain is a very class-conscious society, and I was from what they called an upper middle class family. But the first time I was really exposed to it was when I was about 8 or 9, and I had two best friends, and one was upper middle class like me, and the other was working class, living in a housing project. And my teachers told me I should only be friends with Catherine and not be friends with Susan because she wasn't my type. And I was outraged at this because I knew exactly what they meant, and I disagreed.
What age is that?
I was about 9. Yeah,
Very early.
very early.
Yeah. And you remained friends with her or no?
No, when you're that age, it's very hard to keep friendships up.
Yeah.
Susan Neal, her name was, though. I remember her very fondly.
So tell me what brings you to Mississippi and getting involved with it?
Well, I landed in New York and the temperature was 95, and I'd never experienced a temperature like that. So I got on the first Greyhound bus. I had a 99-day, $99 vacation thing. And I got on the first bus to Detroit, where a business friend of my father's lived. His name was Stan Ovshinsky, and he was an anarchist, a very wealthy, very famous anarchist. He worked on solar energy and linked up with General Motors and all sorts of things. And his son had just come back from Mississippi to stock up on his mother's food because he'd been on hunger strike. So he said, "Do you want to come down?" So I said, yes. So
Stan Ovshinsky, not Saul Alinsky.
No, Stan Ovshinsky. You could actually Google him. He's actually quite well known.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful person. He died recently, but.
Can you give me, what are some of the specific things that you saw that might lead you to a radical economic theories?
You mean away from Mississippi, or?
Oh no, it could be Mississippi. Yeah, anything like if you can give me specifics, were there?
No, what I think for me, what I saw in Mississippi was I saw people taking charge of their lives. I saw a movement in progress. The white civil rights workers were more like a kind of a catalyst, because obviously most of the work and most of the struggle was from the people of Mississippi, and they were dynamite. And it was like seeing history in motion, and I had no idea before that could happen. You know, so to read in a book that things had changed and there were mass movements is a very different thing from actually seeing it taking place. It was very exciting, very exciting.
And so at what point are you getting into radical economic theories?
that really came later. I'm going to tell you another story, though, if you want stories from Mississippi. I, of course, got arrested like most people, and it made the British press. And my father was interviewed at one point, and what he said was, if she had only read physics at Oxford, none of this would ever have happened. And I like to think that indeed the economics that I studied did indeed orient me towards a way of interacting with people. Maybe if I'd been a physicist, I don't know. But economics, as I saw it, was a matter of social interaction between people. And so it isn't always about what your wages are or what your standard of living is. It's about your whole life. So seeing what was going on in Mississippi, it wouldn't be correct to describe it as an economic struggle, but it would also be absurd not to recognize that it had economic aspects to it. And so that fed into my understanding, as I saw it, of history and economics and where I would be interested.
Okay, now I want you to take these experiences and start translating
Into
how that
economics.
starts showing up in theory, like what theories you gravitate towards as a result of these experiences.
You weren't in those old days, because I went to college in '64. Although it turned out later that many of my teachers were Marxist, we didn't actually learn any radical economics as an undergraduate. So it really was when I came over to the United States and got a scholarship to Harvard, where I was in the program. And that was 1967, and you're moving into 68, 69, and the anti-war movement. And that was when URPE really started. And the people who were the URPE professors became the URPE people at Harvard. Sam Bowles, Herb Gintis, Arthur McEwen, Tom Weiskopf. We all kind of came together. And we taught a course called Social Science 125, or SOCSci 125. And they were eager to bring me in because they thought I was a really hardcore socialist, because my being left of the Labour Party in Britain translated here as, my goodness, she must be a real commie. In Britain, I was, like a normal left of the Labour Party, but to be left of the Labour Party in the United States in 1967 was, as they saw it, for me to be very radical. Fine by me. So then we actually started reading and studying, and that was when I first started really understanding class theory and Marxism and so on.
Are there... Okay.
So we had study groups. We read exciting things like Domhoff, Who Rules America, and a little bit of Marx on the side. But Marx was perfectly acceptable, but I don't think it was really taken very seriously at that point as presenting a completely alternative understanding of economic relations.
Yeah, were there some specific ideas that really struck you?
Well, of course, anti-imperialism. It's the anti-war movement. So instead of seeing it as kind of big power politics, it was seen as, this is what capitalism leads to. This is imperialism. This is what happens when capital expands overseas. This is a continuation of capitalism and of history. And so that, for many of us, was kind of the entree into an understanding of economic relations.
Okay, so I'm sort of a Marxist novice, and I've read some, and Paul's given me some lessons. But my feeling is that he is actually better known as a critic of capitalism than almost anything else. Like he didn't really lay out what communism was too precisely. So that makes sense, right?
Yeah. No, Marx said very little about what would come afterwards. But in the sense of you mean Paul?
Paul Cooney? Paul Cooney?
Yeah.
He's the one who was teaching me. He was teaching me about Marx.
Oh, okay.
That's how.
Yeah, no, Marx didn't say much about what would come after. But a good, solid critique of something contains within it, I think, a sense of what the alternative is. A sense of if you identify what's the driving force of capitalism, that gets you into how can you have an alternative driving force. So he didn't go into that, but I think it's implicit in a lot of what he wrote.
Okay, so like I understand his theory of how the surplus, who should control control the surplus, which is a mind-altering thing for me. So I get these basic. Was there a sort of a concept like that for you that hit you that you're like, wow, that's just solid?
I think that it's not just the surplus, but the reinvestment of the surplus and the continual expansion of capital. So that a kind of a more liberal view would say, oh, they make profits and they get rich off the work of others, which is true. But to go beyond that and say, actually, they don't even do it in terms of leaving a good life. They actually take that surplus and put it right back into production. They're forced to put it back into production because of competition. And they don't even satisfy themselves. I mean, it's a ridiculous system.
That's capitalism.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, I could almost understand if what they wanted was to, acquire an art gallery or sail around the world or whatever. But that's not what drives them. That's not what drives the economic system. It's this continuous expansion. Grow, 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 or you die. And death for capital means bankruptcy. And if you don't continually invest new technology, new markets, move, other people overtake you and you're dead. So it's like they actually have very little, capitalists have very little freedom in the system either. So that Marx actually talked about the capitalist as being the human embodiment of capital. So rather than the owner of capital, it was more like capital drives the capitalist. And I think that's really important because it takes it away from these are evil people. They may be evil, they may not. That's a different matter. But they're driven to do this.
In a sense, what you're saying is the system produces a certain kind of person.
It does, yeah. So it produces kind of aggression and outreach for the capitalists, and for the workers it produces competition. We're in competition for jobs because of unemployment, and that's perfectly understandable. It's very hard to overcome. That's really in some way the crucial part, that in order to confront capital you have to overcome that competition. That's where it links back to race, because the racial divide is in this country and in many other places a crucial divide. That you can't have welfare because it means supporting them. You can't you can't have decent unemployment compensation because they are lazy. And implicit in a lot of the reactionary politics in the United States is a racial tone. I'm not saying it's explicitly racist or that it's the only thing involved, but it's a very powerful force.
What led you to become involved with URPE? How did that come about?
Well, as I said, that was when I was at Harvard, and the chapter started there. URPE started 68, and I think I came in 69. So that the original people were Wisconsin and Harvard and other places. But I was with the Harvard contingent. And so then I just came in and fitted in fairly well, I think.
What were your hopes for the organization?
I thought we'd be able to present a more coherent picture of what was going on that would contribute to the movement, so that it was as a contribution, that an understanding of the nature of capitalism makes it easier to organize against it, to organize for improvements, to organize for reforms, let alone revolution. You have to understand what you're up against. And so if economic theory and an understanding of the economy can give that to people, it provides a way of empowering them, as I see it.
Were there alternatives, though, that you could present? So rather than just saying, we're against this, were there things that you were able to say, we're for this?
I think there were. I mean, at this point, clearly, most people, not all, but most people were very disillusioned with the Soviet Union. Of course, in the United States, the information we got on the Soviet Union was not the most unbiased information. So that there were good things going on in the Soviet Union, but we didn't know about those. But we did look to Cuba. And I remember being particularly impressed when Arthur McEwen gave a talk about Che Guevara, saying that in a socialist system you were talking about trying to create an alternative person, an alternative economic man, excuse the word man, that would be motivated by love, would be motivated by caring for other people, and that you needed to have a system that would create people like that. I thought, wow, that's wonderful. To think about how your economic system can actually create good people or contribute to creating good people. And so a lot of us looked to Cuba to see what was going on there. And although they were clearly kind of influenced and to many extent under the thumb of the Soviet Union, they always had an independent streak. And I've done more work with Cuba since. I still admire Cuba.
Yeah, Cuba's an interesting example. I mean, my understanding, like we'll go back to my limited understanding of Marx, is that Marx never would have been in favor of a totalitarian state, however. He was like a serious Democrat. And so what happened to me in Russia and China particularly, and also in Cuba though, was that the state got control of the surplus. And really what Marx had wanted all along was the workers to have control of the surplus, which is kind of so mind-bendingly different, it's hard to imagine.
Yeah, but I think the image we've been given of, I know less about the Soviet Union, but the image we've been given of Cuba and of China is that indeed the state became the state capitalist. But if you actually look at what happened, simple things like infant mortality. The infant mortality rate in China fell by a half compared to India in the years of now, which meant that the surplus was being used to develop a healthcare system. And the same thing, Cuba's infant mortality rate is about the same as the United States, although they're very much poorer than the United States. So the surplus is not being used the way capital uses it. I think that's not true. I can understand that argument and that dynamic. But as I say, I like the infant mortality rate as an index because it's a really clear sense. It's so simple to reduce infant mortality. You just have to have good nutrition and good prenatal care and a good postnatal care, and that'll do it. It's simple. Why don't we do it here? Because the profit isn't there. But as an index of development, I think Cuba has developed very well under a socialist system, with the state, yes, in control of the surplus. But when they were faced with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that knocked out their markets, and it was a total disaster, and their production fell by 30%, they kept up child support. Their infant mortality did not fall. They kept up their educational system. They kept up their healthcare system. Adults were losing muscle. I mean, it was really, really serious. But their priorities were just visible. You could actually see the priorities. So that children under 7 had full nutritional supplements. After 7, it got risky. No question, things were rough. But to see those priorities says that the surplus was not simply being used the way it is in capital for, whoa, let's go for more production. It was being used to a very, very large extent to improve the lives of people there. And as I say, in China, the difference, the contrast between the economic development of China from 1949 to, let's say, 1980, compared to India, phenomenal. In terms of education, in terms of healthcare, standard of living, it was phenomenal. So that I see in that socialism, not perfect. I'm sure I'd be, griping if I were there. I'm just a griper. But I hope to constructive criticism. But I think they did wonderful things.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I'm rolling.
I think in the Scandinavian countries, they had very strong labor movements. And if you have a strong labor movement and can indeed contend for power within the capitalist system, you can indeed restrain capital, and you can indeed do things like develop universal health care and so on. And they certainly did that in Scandinavia. So I attribute it to the organization of the working class rather than somehow they had nice capitalists. I don't think they had nice capitalists.
But that's what Marx wanted, was the strong organization of the workers.
Yes, but they're still capitalist countries. And so what's happening now, and if you look at, say, IKEA is a Swedish multinational corporation, and they have plants in the United States, and none of those stores are unionized. None of them. IKEA will make its profit the way it can. What's different in the Scandinavian countries is that they actually have a very high tax rate on the workers that is then redistributed to the other workers so that it's still very profitable for capital to operate. IKEA is not operating on a shoestring, and the corporations in the Scandinavian countries are highly profitable and functioning as multinational corporations. But because the working class has been organized and they've got good, strong parties, they've been able to even it out within the working class, which is enormous and tremendously important. But right now, it's being taken away. Right now, they're cutting back in Europe generally, including in the Scandinavian countries, because the capitalists are still in control.
Yeah.
So it can go so far, but only so far.
Yeah, I guess the discussion then becomes, which did Marx care more about, democracy or getting rid of capitalism?
Well, I think in order to really have democracy, you have to get rid of capitalism, because capitalism is inherently undemocratic. The workplace is not a democracy. Once you go to work, they tell you what to do, and if you don't do what they tell you, they fire you. You are not in control in the workplace. It's that simple. You've given up control of 8 hours a day or 10 or 12 hours, however much it must be, to the people that purchase, that take you on, that take as a wage. You're not free then, and there's no democracy within the workplace. At best, we maybe have a union, which is nice, but there is no concept of democracy within the workplace at all.
So I understand that, I get that, but I'm curious as to, while Cuba's done all these great things with education, with the health indicators and all that, I don't think people there feel democratically involved.
I'm not sure I agree with that. So that, for example, after the collapse of the Cuban economy, by the way, Finland also collapsed because they were very much tied in with the Russian economy. The question was what to do. And they organized meetings in every single community and every single workplace where people were presented with the information to discuss what would be done, and the information was shared. Now, decision-making is a different question, recognize that, but they were involved, people were involved in that discussion on what do we do in this horrible, horrible time. They do have elections, people don't often recognize that, so that there are regular elections that take place, and to be nominated, there are nomination procedures in the workplaces, in the communities. It doesn't work quite the way in the United States, and they don't have a presidential election, but then neither does Britain. Britain doesn't have a presidential election. The prime minister is chosen by the governing party. So the head in Cuba is chosen by the head of the Communist Party, which is indeed the main party, and there are real issues in terms of the extent of democracy in there. So that's something you continually have to work on, no question. So I'm not saying that everything is perfect there, but the idea that somehow we're democratic and they aren't, I just don't think that's a good description of either our system or theirs. I don't see people here being involved in discussion what to do about the banks. Was anybody ever asked about whether they should bail out the banks? I mean, we didn't even know what was going on. I mean, maybe economists kind of helped on some of that. But no, people don't know what's going on. They're uninformed, and they're not consulted. And there's no point, in fact, in being consulted if you're not informed. You just say what you kind of think. But it's hard to understand, and for that, you really need to have a good educational system. So our students, when I teach, our students don't have a clue about democracy, the way the economy functions. They're totally alienated at this point. It's very disconcerting. In the 60s, I think people had a sense we can change things. Turns out we were a little bit wrong on that, but the sense that people could be powerful and that movements could change things was very, very different then. That sense is not here. A little bit. I mean, we had the Occupy movement, and I think that was terrific. Participated as best I could. I never actually slept overnight in Zuccotti Park, but I was there. I try and go where things are happening. But that was the beginning, a sense of involvement, and I have a feeling that may come. It's not here yet. We can't say at this point that we have a movement. We can say there are people that are active, that things are going on, but not that sense that it's up to us as to what our society should be. That's what we want. And then we have to discuss exactly what that would be, and lots of different ideas there.
You raise an interesting point.
Background changed a lot, but I don't know what to fix how to fix
No,
it.
yeah, you can just zoom in a little more maybe. raise an interesting point about Zuccotti, because when I went down there, I was trying to ask them some questions about what they were for, and they said, right now, see over there, there's the library. Right now, we feel like we've been fed so much misinformation that that's our job,
Yeah.
is to inform ourselves first, and then we can start coming up with. So in any case, taking that thinking, what did you think URPE could do? What could it contribute activist-wise?
In the early days, we did things like put out leaflets and information on Nixon and wage price freeze, and actually comment on policy. As things moved on, we didn't do as much of that, so that individual people would make contributions. But the organization didn't really have much of a public political presence. Individuals were active, but the organization had a presence within the economics profession, but clearly not within the movement, because there really wasn't a movement to be in. So it's not so much did we do things wrong as very hard to be actively involved when nothing much is going on. So URPE was involved as best it could in Zuccotti Park. That's nice. So the summer conference that we had right after Zuccotti Park, we brought in Occupy people to discuss with us on some of the issues and so on, and that was exciting. When things pick up again, I'm sure we'll do more of that.
Okay, but I can think of some utility the organization has in general. Tell me, how is it useful to you as a political radical?
Is it outside noise off of that?
Well, I think there are kind of two parts to that. One, theoretically, one has to be continually questioning and challenging one's own ideas and other people's in order collectively to come to an understanding. That's an ongoing process, and that's really very important, as opposed to I know it all and let me tell you what I think. It's not the right way to go about it, because among other things change, but my views have changed over time. I'm glad, because some of them were wrong and some of them were right. And so as an intellectual community, it's very important. It's also played a role...
Sorry, I'm going to stop you for a second. If you could just mention URPE a little bit more when you say these things, like URPE was a great place to exchange ideas.
Okay, yeah, sure. So URPE continues to be a place where, through its conferences and its journal, URPE people, radicals, not just economics, but radical political economists, which is a broader area, can meet, discuss, present papers, exchange ideas, and that continues to be very important. The other way in which URPE is important is that it's the organization that attempts to continue the teaching of radical political economics in our universities. We've tried the high schools, but that's very, very difficult. We'll go into that, but at least within the universities. And that's a very difficult struggle, and one that we've actually been losing in terms of the universities where we have a clear presence. The ability to teach graduate students in particular has been progressively whittled away, so that there used to be a graduate program at Notre Dame, which included, not only, but included the teaching of radical political economics at the graduate level. And the university, over the objections of the economics department at Notre Dame, split the department in two, with the real people on one side and the flaky people, meaning URPE and radicals, only allowed to teach undergraduates. So that URPE is the place where we continue to try and say, defend the jobs of economists, radical political economists, provide a network so that people who are graduating will at least have a sense of where to go, so that there are some departments that are at least open to having what we call heterodox economists. Got to be broad these days, so that's also very important, and that's a role that URPE plays.
I would say venture on a personal level, when you feel ghettoized in general in your life in this way, it's nice to have a bunch of people who are out there who think like you do.
Yeah, because a lot of people are the only person in their department, and that's very difficult. Because I say you don't have the people to bounce your ideas off. Obviously, we can work with people of all varieties. I have no problems with that. But to be able to develop radical political economic theory, you really need to be in touch with other people. And because we've lost some of those centers, there'll be one person here and two people there and one person isolated over there, and URPE is a kind of a network that's useful. So we're still working on trying to develop that through the website, through a blog. We've got a ways to go. We're technologically a little backward, particularly old folks like me. But some of the younger people coming in are going to carry it forward, which is going to be exciting. But that's really important. So that's something that URPE can do, is maintain those contacts and try and build that. As I say, we did try for high schools, but high schools are very, very authoritarian institutions. And the people teaching economics have very little flexibility as to what they can really cover. So we tried.
What were some of the key and important moments for URPE and for yourself working within the URPE family?
Well, there's the women's movement, of course. So that I, of course, I shouldn't say of course, but I was an active feminist. And the women's movement was eye-opening for me and for most people, both women and men. And URPE was an old boys network with a few women in there, like me. And when it became apparent that there was just the normal lack of respect for women, I don't think URPE was particularly bad on that. The women revolted and stormed out of a meeting at the summer conference, formed a women's caucus, demanded changes, insisted that women be actively involved in the leadership of the organization, and began to develop, again, the theory at the same time, so that we put out various issues of the journal which focused on women's theory, on feminist theory, and that was exciting. That led into some of my own work. I don't know if that's relevant, but
Tell me like what are, now this is where you can't get too
technical.
Too technical.
I won't get technical on
Keep
you.
it simple. Like,
Yeah.
are there things that you feel like you've contributed to the report? Like, what concepts have you added?
My work is on the concept of household production. And most people think of that as being a matter of gender relations. Oh, women do household production. I agree that that's an important part of it. And that my interest in household production came out of my involvement in the feminist movement. But I look at it also as a portion of production, rather than just what women do. So I've looked at household production and feudalism, in which, for example, not technical, that if we talk about the surplus as being what's produced that is consumed. Yeah, the old concept of the surplus in feudalism was 3 days on your own fields and 3 days on the fields of the Lord. Okay. They forgot about all the household servants in the Lord's estate who had to take care of the kids, grow the vegetables, cook the meals, do the whole... and roughly, that took at least half the labor of people between the ages of, say, 13 and 26 were household servants. They were not field workers. That was part of surplus production, which is completely ignored. So that whole portion of production kind of dropped out of sight, because today we think of, oh, household production, that's women dusting the furniture. It's like, peasant women don't dust furniture. They're out in the fields, their own fields, but also the Lord's fields, or household servants. So that while Marx was looking at factory workers, and his genius was to understand that the factory represented the most advanced form of capitalist development, there were more people working as household servants than factory workers in 1850. There were many, many more people as household servants. And I think that's important, both women and men. And so there was a gender division within that. But so that's what some of the work that I do, household production.
Is trying to quantify that and add that to
Well, in the 11th century, the data isn't very good. but the concepts you can get at. And we have some now. I mean, here you've got data we can look at now. So that many people make, I think, a very serious mistake when they think that the increasing performance of wage labor by women represents the success of the women's movement. What I see it as is the movement of some portion of production from the household into the market, so that you buy your processed food. You don't do it yourself. If you go further back, you used to chop wood for your own fireplace. Now you have central heating and you buy the electricity. So production has moved from the household into the workplace, and women have moved out of the household and into the workplace, and that's driven by production, not by gender relations. Now it interacts then with gender relations, no question. So that when women do begin to work outside the home and bring in more of the money, indeed that does alter their position within households. But whether that constitutes an advance is a different question, because if you look today, the poverty is still among women. And why is the poverty among women? Because now they aren't married anymore, it's single mothers, so that the gender relations have changed now. And the form of oppression of women has changed. I'm not saying there aren't things that are better, that's clearly true. But the idea that simply having a job means that women are now liberated, I think is a real misreading of economics and of gender relations. So that's where some of my work goes. It's not always very popular, either with the Marxists or with the feminists, but you do the best you can.
Oh, that's good. That's cool.
And we haven't talked about activism.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. In what ways are you an activist? And then if you've got any stories.
Okay. I'm an activist wherever I can be. I believe in organization. Organization is absolutely crucial and has lost me several jobs. So that the first full-time job I had at UMass Boston was great. I actually had the possibility of going to UMass Amherst, where a lot of the radicals went, but I wanted to be in a city. I'm more an urban person. And what do we do there? Well, we got a women's center, we got daycare provided, we tried to, but failed to organize the cafeteria workers. When the bookstore was being devolved from the university to Barnes & Noble, used to be student workers, they came to me and said, we're losing our jobs. I said, let's see what we can do about that. And so we organized a boycott of the bookstore, and something like a half of the faculty members sent their book orders to an outside bookstore. We lost in the end, and we had to call it off. It's important to know when to back off. You have to use your energy appropriately. What else did we do? I'm not sure which of those got me fired. Not sure. The official reason that they gave, this is fun, the official reason that they gave was that my PhD thesis, which had been approved by Harvard University, I don't think it's the best university in the world, but it's often thought to be. They said it didn't meet minimum standards of good scholarship. I'm going, so it was interesting. It was clearly a political firing. And URPE had managed to get in the American Economics Association a committee set up to deal with political discrimination. And I think mine might have been the first case. And they sent a delegation to UMass Boston, including Ken Arrow, but other important big people who came and investigated and said, sure does look suspicious, but we can't prove it, which was what I expected would happen. But that was how I lost my job at UMass Boston. But I feel I did a good job there, and nothing to be ashamed of. So that was good. So that's it. I say wherever I am, I try and be active, organizationally.
There's got to be a sense in which if you don't get punished at some point, maybe you're not being activist enough.
I think so. I've been at my current college for a long time, and my criterion for success is that I should receive an average of 2 reprimands a year. I mean, I'm so privileged to have tenure at a college and a decent salary and so on, that if I don't stick my neck out, I should be ashamed of myself. And, you know, for many people, even going on a demonstration is risky, particularly for undocumented workers, obviously. If they're brave enough to demonstrate and to act, and I'm not, give me a break. You just absolutely have to. You have to stand up. You have to do the best you can. So, you know, taking my students to Zuccotti Park, demonstration on the Iraq War. I think we actually had more faculty than students on that one, but it's hard to organize students sometimes. But wherever you are, you try and act, and with other people. So to me, the active and the theoretical are two sides of the same coin. I don't know that I could be working theoretically if I weren't involved actively, because that's where you see the reality that you're trying to organize and change. And the two, to me, are kind of, you know, go hand in hand.
Can we get a little more fundamental than that? Like, what, you're a very moral agent in the world. Where does that come from?
I have no idea.
Was there, I mean, aside that school incident was a good one. You know, is there something that drives you to care about people who are in tough circumstances?
It just seems to come normally. I'm not sure what drives me. I mean, seeing the successes helps. Civil rights movement helped. And who couldn't want to be part of that is my feeling. I don't feel that I'm sacrificing. I feel like I'm the lucky one being involved in this. I find it very rewarding. You know, I mean, I love being involved. I put it at kind of the top of my list of things to do. You know, when people are busy, you have to prioritize things. Organization and activism comes at the top of my list. I try not to ignore my other responsibilities, because I have kids, among other things. But it's how I live. It's what you have to do, I think.
In what ways has URPE been a success?
It's kept
radical. So say again, just try to use URPE.
Yeah, URPE has kept radical political economics alive. We succeeded. URPE is one of the few organizations from the late 60s, early 70s that has lasted as an organization with membership that continues to meet and discuss into the present day. There are radical caucuses in other disciplines, often larger than us, so that the radical sociologists, very large and terrific group of people, and they have a journal, but they're not an organization that has membership and that continues to act as an organization. So I think just survival is an incredible accomplishment. I really think that we need to be very proud of URPE members for having just survived. And we survived some of the sectarianism of the 70s that split many people apart. I don't claim to be totally innocent of that. We were all involved, but we did survive. Other people maybe did better than me on that. But we survived, we continued, and we're still here. And more recently, we've made an effort to recognize that the continued success requires involving younger people so that the organization continues. I'm a big organization person, whether it's unionization or anti-war or whatever it is. But within radical political economics, you need organization in order to be able to continue. And URPE has succeeded in that and has actually been growing recently. Our membership has been increasing. I say we're not doing too well in terms of defending our programs at the universities, but there are more radical political economists now than there were 10 years ago. And that's large part because URPE has continued. People don't just pop out of the woodwork. It's like, oh, I've suddenly become a radical. There needs to be a connection. There needs to be continuity. And we've provided that. So I think URPE has been a real success. Not that there haven't been problems, but we've been good.
That's good. Yeah. In what ways has URPE been a failure?
I think the big failure is that we have not addressed race. We have not addressed racial relations, particularly in the United States. URPE is an overwhelmingly white organization. We have many third world people and people from other countries, but we are not organizationally hospitable to African Americans in the United States, or to Latinos, perhaps a little more because of our connection with Latin Americans. But it's a big weakness in the United States. So that the failure to address that, and we don't know how to. It isn't that we haven't discussed it, but we have failed. And we will continue to work on how we can address that. But within the United States, it's a white organization. And insofar as we're trying to address the issues facing the working class as a whole in the United States, that's not good enough. We have to be able to address and work with African Americans. That's, I think, is our biggest failure.
Okay, you had on the economics profession.
I don't think we've had all that much influence, but then I'm not sure that I would expect us to. I think we continue to challenge, but I think the real challenge to the economics profession has to be the political movement that gave rise to URPE. So that URPE and the radical economists came out of the movement of the 60s and 70s. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement generated the challenge to the economics profession, and the URPE economists then carried it forward. But is the economics profession very different now from what it was 20, 40, 80 years ago? I would say no. I would say they're still understandably hostile to radical political economics. They are tied in to the ruling class, if you want to use that word, but they have no concept but that capitalism is the best of all possible worlds, and it's built into their theory. And some of the theory is just, to me, ludicrous. For example, they are incapable of understanding a fairly simple question: why haven't wages in the United States increased much over the last 40 years? That seems a fairly simple question. And their theory says, marginal productivity theory, and it just doesn't work. And they just cannot accept that challenge. So that they're stuck. Their theory is a bind to them. Obviously, they're also culpable in terms of not being able to address climate change. So that within capitalism, the reason that businesses don't care about the future is because that's how capitalism works. That you want your profits now, and money now is worth more than money next year, on the year, and by the time you get 50 years, who cares? And so they don't, the theory and the practice of a capitalism means that the technical word is you discount the future. So that what happens 30, 40 years in the future doesn't matter. Well, I'm sorry, they're wrong. It does matter. And if you use the tools of neoclassical theory, it doesn't matter. You discount the loss by a factor of 50, and then who cares?
Sorry, guys,
Sorry.
hold on.
That's me. I'm like trying to not to do that. Sorry.
Just turn the thing around. Wow, I was not expecting this out of this question. It's good. Okay, yeah, so carry on. I mean,
About the climate change?
Yeah.
Yeah, so within neoclassical economics, the method that is used is the method that in fact is carried out in the world of business. That literally, if you invest $1 today, it gets you $1.10 in the future. So $1.10 in the future is only worth $1 today.
Be careful of this.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so the future is discounted. And as long as you accept that, which comes out of the functioning of capitalism, you discount and disregard the damage that will be done 20, 30 years, quite apart from the fact that the damage is being done to the people of Bangladesh. And they obviously, to neoclassical economists, don't count as much as the people in such fine upstanding countries as the United States. And their lives are not worth as much. Larry Summers got caught on this. Larry Summers, who was, you could look him up, I can't remember. Said the economic logic behind distributing toxic waste to poor wage countries is impeccable. It is absolutely economically logical to take toxic waste from the United States and put it in low-wage countries because they don't value their lives as much, do they? And wouldn't they be willing to take it if you give them a little bit of money? And wouldn't it make sense to give them a little bit of money, whereas in the United States you have to give people a lot of money? Therefore, let's dump the toxic waste in poor wage countries. He put it in a memo, which was a mistake, I guess, because it kind of came out. But he's right that the economic logic, which is the economics of capitalism, is impeccable. You save money by dumping it in poor countries. Ask them how much they'll take compared to how much people in the United States would take. They'll take less.
So that kind of gets to the core of the issue for you. There's like, it's an economics of injustice.
Yeah. It is. So, it's built into the economic system, but then it's built into and becomes part of the economic theory that justifies and explains as logical and impeccable the way that capitalism functions, so that you get to the Margaret Thatcher thing, there is no alternative. But she also said there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals. And from that perspective, you've lost everything human that makes people human. Human beings are social beings, and she denied that.
If you could change one thing in economics today, what would it be and why is it the most important thing?
In economic theory or in the economic world? In the economic theory?
You can give
I'm
me
not
both.
sure.
Because I've long thought.
Okay.
For
If
instance,
I were thinking economic policy, what I think we really have to focus on is organizing workers, so that at the moment we do not have the right to unionize. We have it in legal terms, that you cannot be fired for collective organizing. Tell that to someone that dares raise a peep in the workplace. I think that's absolutely essential. Not that there shouldn't be organizing other places, but we are incapable in the United States of forming unions. If you ask people would they like a union, they generally say yes. We've got a clear majority. But when I'm talking about it in my classes with students, I say, do be careful, because the quickest way to lose your job is to say, I think it would be nice if we had a union here. Managers in places like Walmart, Toys R Us, are trained to spot people who might be dissatisfied and therefore likely to form some kind of organization, and get rid of them. And you get rid of them not by saying they're going to form a union, but because no one's perfect. So you're going to be fired for having a bad attitude. That's legal. So we have no ability to organize. I think that's more important than going after corporate finance. I just assume that our politicians are in hock to big business. I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to change that. I'm not opposed to working on campaign finance, but I'm an organization person. I think the most important thing is to help people organize. Allow people to organize might be a better way of saying it.
what must we do to advance radical economic thinking?
Get out there. Get out
Try
there.
to recapitulate the question.
Okay. If we want radical economic theory to become important, to get out there, we have to be involved in where people are learning that. We have to be involved in the social movements insofar as we can. Obviously, some of it has to be taught in the universities, but having taught in the universities for many years, I forget how many, but 40 or something like that, I don't think people become aware of the injustices of capitalism by learning theory in a classroom. I think they have to be involved, and then the theory can become relevant, so that it's the involvement that becomes important. Now, it's not that every teacher, every radical political economist has to be doing that, so that insofar as people are themselves organizing, it can be useful for radical economists to link up with them. It's not that radical economists, heaven knows, are going to do all the hard work of organizing. But I think it has to be through a connection with the activities that people are doing. I don't think it can be done as an intellectual exercise. Sit down and I will persuade you that capitalism is unjust. I don't think it works that way. I think people need to have not just a sense. People have a sense that things are unjust. But they don't really connect it with the way that the whole economic system works. But once they start challenging that, then they become open. And then they might even remember a course that they took 5, 10, 15 years ago. So that could kind of feed into it. But it won't become a force until people are organized.
So it is a matter. It is a matter.
So
You're basically saying it's important for people to have some experience
yes.
of injustice to be able to even respond to the theories that produced it.
Well, I think we've got plenty of injustice to respond to, but the awareness of it and the recognition that other people have similar problems and that collectively something can be done about it. That's kind of steps 1 and 2. 1, you recognize you're not alone. 2, you recognize that together you might be able to do something about it. 3, you try. You may fail, but in failing you can still learn, and then you try again. And as people act, they learn what worked and what didn't. The US civil rights movement didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of decades, centuries of struggle, where people had learned from mistakes, from successes, and that had been carried through among that population so that they were able to use that when it became possible, particularly in the 60s, to actually carry that forward dramatically. So some people talk about what happened in the South as a kind of a second civil rights movement or a second revolution that fundamentally changed even economic relations in the South, so that the experience carries through.
Okay. I mean, is there some sense? I mean, what's really cool about Occupy, as far as I'm concerned, is the very idea of the 99% is an economic idea.
Wonderful.
Can you talk about how Occupy is perhaps like the best thing for radical political economists?
Oh, Occupy was fantastic. So that the concept of the 99% and the 1% went into, it rang a bell with everybody in the United States, including the 1% who didn't particularly like it. But it made so much sense to people that it was a relatively small step to move from there to saying the 99% are doing the work and the 1% are getting rich from it. And that's the basics, that's a starting point. And they brought it into the popular language. And you could talk to people anywhere. I walked around with a big button all the time, so that even on the subway, people would be talking to me. And I'd have posters, and they'd say, "What's in your poster?" And I would fill it with a poster. Everybody loved it. And I think it was a really important step forward so you can talk about the 1% without people saying, "You're a crazy communist." You say, "Well, maybe I am, but isn't there a 1%? Can't we talk about that?" So I think the Occupy movement did a tremendous step in terms of moving things forward, no question.
Is there a way that URPE can help capitalize on Occupy, revitalize it, something?
I'm not sure we can, the 400 or so members of URPE can revitalize the Occupy movement. We're not that
but you
important.
Part of their library,
oh,
like
yeah.
giving them the information people need.
Yeah, so that a lot of the work that URPE does is at a theoretical level that is important, but is not accessible to general population, or even to some of us. I don't understand some of the theory that people are putting out. And not that the theory doesn't have to be done on some high level at some point, but we do need to be more involved in getting material out in an understandable way. There are several organizations that are not formally part of URPE, but have been spin-offs that do really good work. So that Dollars and Cents magazine is run by people who came out of URPE and still URPE members. And there they do fairly short articles, which are really very useful for people. So that URPE itself hasn't been doing that. I hope that as we develop our blog, we can get a little bit more into a conversation with people and put more ideas out there on a regular level. But we aren't there yet. So that at this point, we're not very good at putting our ideas in a form that can be used by mass movements. So I say individuals can do that. So individuals may be working with trade unions, they may be working with community groups, they may be working with anything that's going on, but as individuals rather than the organization. And so the organization may support them, but I don't think URPE at this point is really doing that. I think we know we need to, and we're working towards it.
I don't know. That might be the ideal, is that, that people from URPE go do Dollars and Cents. That's pretty ideal.
Yeah.
Especially since you are a heterodox organization.
Sure.
That's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, so people need to branch off and do other things, but still be URPE members, because we still need that. We still need those relations. It's still important to keep that going.
I think URPE could okay, talk to me a little about GDP.
GDP is a hopeless measure of the productive ability of a country. It counts as production all the work we do cleaning up the mess that capitalism has created. So cleaning up after Sandy, cleaning up after Katrina is counted as production. Well, excuse me, I'm glad that we do the cleanup, but you can't count that as part of production. You have to count that as simply doing away with some of the damage that was done, and that's not. So GDP includes that as production. That's ridiculous.
If we could take that again, I think a better example would be something like the Exxon Valdez, like a mistake born of capitalism rather than a natural disaster.
Okay.
Is probably a better example. Or
Yeah.
even the World Trade Center going down probably increased GDP, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, Exxon Valdez was a wonderful experience for all the people and the businesses employed in the cleanup. And there were jobs involved in that cleanup, and each of those counted as part of production. And even the insurance claims that were filed were good for the insurance companies, more business. But that's not production. That should be a deduction from production. So that GDP is a hopeless measure, a really fundamentally flawed measure of the production of a country. Fundamentally flawed.
Is there another measure you like?
Various people have come up with alternative measures. The UN has the Human Development Index, but they compromise so that it includes a measure of GDP per capita, which it shouldn't. You should junk GDP. You can do that. Even some neoclassical economists have talked about things like, is US is US defense spending a contribution to production? Even if you think it's necessary, you can't say we're better off if we have to spend more on defense. It's not contributing to human well-being. It may be preventing a terrorist attack. Let's suppose it is. It's still not contributing to our well-being. That shouldn't be in there either. You might decide you want to spend that, but you can't say that we're better off because we're spending more on defense, but that's what GDP says. Let's add in government spending on defense, look at all the activity that's taking place in Afghanistan and Iraq, add that on to GDP. No, people are being killed over there, including the soldiers. So that it's a disaster in terms of production. But no, GDP is a hopeless measure.
What other aspects, what other things that are taught in Econ 101 are disastrous conceptually for you? Or
The one I think is the most ridiculous is the determination of unemployment as taught in microeconomics, which says that if wages fall, businesses will want to hire more people. Possible, yeah, we can put that aside. Then they say if wages fall, less people will want to work. And I'm going, wait, so if your wages cut from $20 an hour, which is about the average, to $16 an hour, you say, oh, I'll go sit on the beach. I mean, it's completely wrong. So that in fact, when wages fall, people have to work more. Kids have to go out to work. People who are retired have to go back to work. Students have to take jobs. People have to do overtime. So that their theory is that the only way to deal with unemployment is to cut wages, and that will increase the quantity demanded, reduce the quantity supplied, and then you get equilibrium. And it's rubbish. It's complete and absolute rubbish. The Federal Reserve actually recognizes that, so that when the Federal Reserve is looking at the data on employment, they look at how many people want to work. They recognize that. They recognize that concept, but microeconomics doesn't. And the other thing that's absurd is that that the teaching of what determines wages is done entirely within microeconomics, and it's not even mentioned when you're looking at the macroeconomy as a whole. It's simply not there. So in the macroeconomics, there is no distinction drawn between profits and wages. There is no recognition of the concept that wages are somehow connected, let's say, to unemployment, which is fairly obvious and people know that, but it's not in your macroeconomic theory. So you could go through a whole macroeconomics course and have no understanding that unemployment reduces wages. And I said that
capitalism, in fact, depends on it.
Yeah, absolutely necessary.
Is there anything else like that?
Yeah.
All right, yeah, tell me.
Yeah, one other thing that's completely out of date is the way in which we collect our figures, so that when we talk about US production, gross domestic product, we look at it in geographical terms. That's how it's defined, the production that takes place geographically within the United States. We live in a globalized world where our multinational corporations carry out production in many countries around the world. So that within the United States, we have people employed by HSBC, British corporation. We have people employed by IKEA, Swedish corporation. People in Thailand are employed by General Motors. And so we don't understand that we're living in a world in which capital is international, is global. And that what we should be looking at is global production under capital and global capital in relationship to global labor. And the way, it's very hard to even get information on that. So that we talk about trade, and people say, well, so we're not exporting enough and we're importing too much. The biggest exporter, the biggest, General Motors is the biggest exporter of goods from Mexico to the United States, because they have plants in Mexico and they produce parts which are imported into the United States. That counts as US imports. Some people have said, and I don't know the data, but reliable people have said about 1/3 of total trade takes place within corporations. General Motors Germany to General Motors France, General Motors Mexico to General Motors US to General Motors Canada. And so when we talk about trade, we tend to think of it as if the relations are between countries. And in fact, a large part of it is within corporations. We are so out of date. Even neoclassical economists should be able to recognize that. but they're not, they're conservative with a small c, not interested in challenging those kind of things. So our whole concept of production is off base.
So you would say that, and other radical political economists told me this, that neoclassical economics is, as mathematically oriented as it is, it's mathematically full of holes.
Absolutely full of holes, and what we call is full of internal inconsistencies. You know, like 2 + 2 is not equal to 4, so that it's not equal to 5. So that the internal inconsistencies, so that you can dismantle it if you want, if you're willing to look at it. It just doesn't hold up. It's not logically coherent. Quite apart from not describing the world.
Okay, wait. I want you to give me that answer one more time, but
Okay.
say neoclassical economics.
Okay, neoclassical economics is internally inconsistent, that it can be dismantled by showing that some of the ways in which it expresses things are as false as 2 + 2 = 5. There are internal inconsistencies. It makes no sense, quite apart from the fact that it doesn't describe the real world.
I think we should.
The constraints.
Yeah, the constraints.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
What you feel constrained about is good. Okay.
I teach in a small college, and the students are commuting students. They're not from the top, certainly not the 1%, but not even the top 20%. And they are understandably concerned about getting jobs, is their main concern. And they are scared of ideas that seem to be radical. And within the college that I teach at, and it's no fault of the college, it's not really practical to give them courses in Marxist economic theory. They're not open to it. We are required on some level it's a job. I have a job. And the job requires that I teach the stuff that is going to be used in other courses in other departments. So that there are really serious limits to what can actually be conveyed in a class, particularly because people aren't really open to this. In different times, when Occupy was going, you could have whole classes on the 1% and the 99%. That opened up the space to be able to do things. But in regular times, you can't really do that. And to try and introduce that seems to them to be problematic. When you move to the upper level courses, where the students have taken several courses and can deal with things on a more sophisticated level intellectually, then it becomes possible to point out some of these inconsistencies and to develop students' understanding of things that are not neoclassical. And that can be done, and people can be open to it. So that I'm always very careful to recognize that people approach things from a very different perspective, and I'm not about to challenge their ideological views, but I can point out internal inconsistencies. I can point out that I think human lives are important rather than dollars. I don't have any problems pointing that out. And so that an evaluation of climate change that ignores human lives or considers human lives in other countries less valuable than us, I think that's wrong. I have no problem in saying that. But to challenge the overall fundamental structure at the very introductory level of a freshman, I don't find myself able to do that. Other people may. Maybe I'm not saying that can't be done. I'm saying I don't find myself able to do that.
Are you able to do something like say, look, here's the theory, so you know it. My opinion is this theory is very faulty, but here's what you should do.
I'll take some particular cases to show them, so that rather than just say I think the whole thing is a pack of lies. You can't really do that. You can't require them to read a neoclassical textbook and then tell them at the same time it's a pack of lies. You just can't do that. You can take one little piece and say this isn't good, and if you go on, I can show you, later on, you can look at a more fundamental critique. I can say that. But you can't simultaneously teach neoclassical economics and say it's a pack of lies. It just doesn't work. That's how I find
Such
it.
is the
Yeah.
fate of the radical political economists.
Yeah, yeah.